A millionaire banker desperately searches for his missing son when he finds him in an alley, comforted by a homeless girl who offers her only bottle of water to the thirsty child. "Here, you look thirsty," she whispers softly, unaware that he is the son of one of the richest men in the country. But as the millionaire approaches, he does something that leaves the girl in absolute shock. The afternoon air hung over the city like a damp wool blanket, sticking Richard's expensive linen shirt to his body. Every honking cab, every cry of a street vendor, every engine roaring through the gridlocked streets was a needle piercing his composure, which was unraveling by the second. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar beast, climbed his throat, squeezing it with icy claws. Where was Luke? His son, his little Luke, only 6 years old, had vanished. A moment's distraction, a business call that couldn't wait, and the small hand he'd been holding had slipped away. For nearly an hour now, Richard had been racing down the sidewalks, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The world around him, normally a chessboard where he moved the pieces with calculated precision, had morphed into a chaotic and hostile labyrinth. The faces in the crowd were anonymous blurs, indifferent to his agony. He shouted his son's name, his voice raw with desperation, but the sound was swallowed by the deafening roar of the metropolis. His instinct, honed by years at the pinnacle of the financial world, guided him down paths his logic would have scorned. He left the main avenue, the gleam of storefronts and the comfort of conditioned air spilling from luxury boutiques, and plunged into a narrow, forgotten alley. The smell of damp rot and fried food saturated the air. The walls, peeling and covered in faded graffiti, seemed to close in on him. It was a separate universe, a place where the sun fought to touch the cracked asphalt. And it was there, in the back of that silent alley, that he saw him. Luke was huddled next to a dumpster, his face streaked with tears and grime, sobs shaking his small body. An overwhelming relief washed over Richard, so intense his legs buckled. He took a step forward, ready to run and embrace his son, to scold him and cover him in kisses all at once. But he stopped, frozen. Someone else was there, a girl, perhaps a little older than Luke, with bare, dirty feet, tangled hair, and a frayed dress that had once been colorful. She didn't see him. Her eyes, of a seriousness unusual for her age, were fixed on the crying boy. With a slow, careful movement, like someone offering a treasure, she held out a plastic bottle with a little water in it. Luke looked at her, hesitant, his sobs quieting. The girl unscrewed the cap with effort and, without a word, placed the bottle in his hands. Richard watched, hidden by the shadow of the alley's entrance, his heart still racing, but now for a different reason. He saw his son drink the water greedily, the sound of his thirst being quenched, echoing in the alley's silence. The girl sat beside him, an unlikely guardian, and in a soft voice, almost a whisper, said, "It's okay. You don't have to be scared. I'll stay here with you until someone finds you." The gesture, so pure and selfless, hit Richard with the force of a punch. In this world of indifference, in this forgotten place, a child who had nothing was offering everything she possessed. He felt a lump form in his throat, an emotion he couldn't name. As he watched the small, resilient figure of the girl, sensing that her steady gaze hid a story far deeper than the dust on her face. He needed to approach, but something held him to the shadows. The image seared into his mind in a way he knew he would never forget. The moment of hesitation dissolved like mist in the sun. Richard straightened his shoulders, his natural authority returning to his posture, but he softened his expression before stepping out of the shadows. He walked slowly down the alley, his expensive Italian leather shoes making a muffled sound on the pavement. 2 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Luke, too, with a choked cry of "Daddy!" ran to him and clung to his legs, burying his face in the fine fabric of his trousers. Richard wrapped an arm around him, relief coursing through his body in a warm, trembling wave. But his eyes remained on the girl. She got to her feet, not in fear, but with a watchful calm. There was a dignity in her posture that belied her ragged clothes and bare feet. She took a step back, as if ready to vanish into the urban landscape, her mission accomplished. "Wait," Richard said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Thank you. Thank you so much for looking after him." She just nodded, her gaze firm, unreadable. Her eyes, a deep brown, seemed to carry the weight of stories he could barely imagine. Richard knelt, getting down to Luke's level, but without taking his eyes off her. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl hesitated for a second, as if weighing the value of that information. "Lena," she answered, her voice low but clear. "Lena, I'm Richard, Luke's father." He took his wallet from his pocket, an almost automatic gesture. The solution he knew for every problem. The world ran on transactions, on rewards for services rendered. He pulled out a few crisp $100 bills, an amount that was insignificant to him, but which he knew would be a fortune to someone like her. "I want to thank you. Please, take this." He held out the money, but Lena took another step back, shaking her head. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "You don't have to," she said. He was thirsty. The simplicity of her answer disarmed him. There was no wounded pride or false modesty in her refusal. There was only a fact. The boy was thirsty, and she had water. It was that simple. For her, it wasn't a transaction. It was an act of humanity. Her refusal left him motionless, the money in his hand, feeling strangely foolish and inadequate. He put the bills away, his skin burning with an embarrassment he hadn't felt in years. He stood up, holding Luke's hand tightly. "Let's go, son." As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Lena one last time. She was already walking away, heading deeper into the alley, a small silhouette against the brick wall. She didn't look back, all the way back to the car. Luke's silence in the back seat was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in Richard's mind. The luxury of the car's interior, the smell of new leather, the soft hum of the air conditioning, it all felt fake, an artificial barrier against the real world he had just glimpsed in that alley. He looked at his son in the rearview mirror, now asleep, safe in his state-of-the-art car seat. The image of Lena, barefoot and resolute, superimposed itself over Luke's. They were two children, two distinct universes colliding for a brief moment. A debt had been created. He felt it in his bones. But it was a debt that money couldn't repay, and that realization disturbed him profoundly. He had to do something, but he didn't know what. The image of her gaze, firm and resigned, wouldn't leave his mind. He knew, with a disconcerting certainty, that he couldn't just forget. That encounter hadn't been an accident. It was the start of something he didn't yet understand, a piece moving on his perfectly ordered board, threatening to change the game forever. The following days were a silent torture for Richard. In his office on the top floor of the skyscraper that served as the headquarters for his financial empire, the world stretched out below him, a model of concrete and glass that he used to command with a simple phone call. But now, it all seemed distant and colorless, the numbers dancing across his monitor screens, which once sang a melody of power and success, had become a monotonous, meaningless drone. He presided over meetings with his mind miles away, lost in the image of a damp alley and a pair of brown eyes that stared back at him with a gravity he couldn't decipher. His partners noticed his distraction, attributing it to the stress of his son's near abduction, a rumor that had spread quickly through the corridors of power. They offered him condolences and advice, never imagining that the source of his unease was not the danger that had passed, but the humanity he had found. He felt like an imposter in his own world. Lena's generosity, an act so small and so immense, had exposed a crack in his armor of pragmatism. He, who measured the value of everything in figures, was confronted by a gesture whose worth was incalculable. That night, in his cold, minimalist mansion, his wife, Beatrice, watched him over the rim of her wine glass. She was a woman of sculpted beauty and sharp ambition, a business partner, as much as a wife. "You've been strange ever since the incident with Luke," she said, her voice as crisp as crystal. "You need to get over it, Richard. Weakness isn't an option in our world." He just nodded, lacking the energy to argue. How could he explain to her that it wasn't weakness that haunted him, but a strength he didn't recognize? How could he describe the dignity of a barefoot girl to a woman who measured a person's character by the brand of their shoes? He knew Beatrice wouldn't understand. To her, people like Lena were invisible, part of the dirty landscape to be avoided or, at best, ignored. The conversation died there, in a chasm of silence and misunderstanding. That night, Richard barely slept. The image of Lena refused to fade. Who was she? Where did she live? Why was she alone in that alley? The questions assailed him, demanding answers. The next morning, he made a decision. He couldn't continue in this paralysis. He picked up the phone and called Matthews, his head of security, a discreet and efficient man who solved his problems without asking questions. Matthews' voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional. "Sir," Richard hesitated for a second, feeling ridiculous. "Matthews, I need you to find someone for me. A girl. Her name is Lena." He described the encounter in the alley, her appearance, her refusal of the money. He provided the approximate location and time, every detail etched in his memory. "I want to know everything about her, where she lives, who with, what her situation is. But be discreet, extremely discreet. No one, not even my wife, can know about this." There was a pause on the other end. "Understood, sir," Matthews replied. "Consider it done." Richard hung up, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. He had set the machine in motion. Now all he could do was wait, but the waiting was agonizing. Every passing hour heightened his apprehension. What would Matthews discover? Late that afternoon, his personal phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. He answered, his heart pounding. "Sir," it was Matthews's voice, graver than usual. "We found the girl, but there's a problem, a serious one." Richard's heart leaped. "What problem, Matthews? Is she okay?" The thought that something might have happened to Lena, perhaps as a consequence of their brief meeting, struck him with an unexpected guilt. "She's fine, sir. Physically, at least." Matthews's voice was cautious. "But her situation is complicated, extremely precarious." Richard felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, but the anxiety remained. "Explain." He stood up and walked to the panoramic window, watching the city lights begin to flicker below, small, cold stars in a sea of asphalt. "Her full name is Lena Santos. She's 10 years old, and she doesn't exactly live in one place. She and her grandmother, a woman named Inez, are living in a single room in the back of a dilapidated tenement building, a few blocks from where you found her. And they're about to be evicted." The information landed like a stone in Richard's stomach. Evicted. The word carried a brutal weight. "Why?" he asked, his voice tight. "The grandmother is sick," Matthews continued. "Very sick. It seems to be something degenerative. She can't work anymore. She used to be a laundress. Lena is the one trying to make some money, selling candy bars at traffic lights, doing odd jobs. But it's not enough for the rent, which is already 3 months overdue." Richard closed his eyes. The image of Lena offering Luke the water taking on a new, more painful and poignant dimension. She, who barely had enough to eat, hadn't hesitated to share the little she possessed. The dignity he'd seen in her wasn't just a character trait, it was armor forged in the harshest of realities. "And the parents?" he asked, dreading the answer. "The mother abandoned her with the grandmother when she was a baby, never seen again. The father is unknown, an orphan, caring for a sick grandmother, fighting the world alone." The story was so cruelly simple, it felt like a soap opera cliché, but Richard knew from Matthews's tone that it was the unvarnished, harsh truth. The landlord, a guy named Taggart, gave them an ultimatum. If they don't pay by the end of the week, he's throwing them out. And he's not a patient man. Matthews paused. And there's more, sir. Taggart is bad news. He exploits the tenants, and there are rumors that he's been helping girls Lena's age find work. You understand me? A chill ran down Richard's spine. That alley, which for him had been a brief glimpse into a different world, was Lena's dangerous playground, the territory where she fought daily for survival, surrounded by predators. He felt suffocated. This was no longer an abstract problem, a matter of curiosity or a moral debt. It was an emergency. A girl and her sick grandmother were days away from being thrown onto the street at the mercy of men like Taggart, and he was the only one who knew. The responsibility fell on his shoulders with a crushing weight. "Matthews," he said, his voice firm, the hesitation gone, replaced by a cold resolve, "I want you to pay the back rent, all of it, and pay for the next 6 months. Use a proxy, someone who can't be traced back to me. Taggart can't know where the money came from. Say it was an anonymous donation from a church, anything. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "And Matthews," Richard added, his voice lowering, "keep an eye on Taggart. I want to know every step that man takes, every move. If he so much as looks in Lena's direction, I want to know immediately. It will be done." "Sir?" Richard hung up the phone and stood there, staring out at the city. He had interfered. He had moved a piece on the board, a piece that didn't belong to him. The feeling was not one of power, as it usually was, but of a deep, unfamiliar fear. He had entered a game whose rules he didn't know, and he felt that in trying to protect Lena, he might have just put her in even greater danger. Richard's solution was swift, anonymous, and, in his mind, efficient. The money was delivered to Taggart by an unknown lawyer, claiming to represent a charitable foundation. The landlord, a beefy man with small, greedy eyes, accepted the thick envelope with few questions. For Lena and her grandmother, the news came as a miracle. Inez, a frail woman whose body was a map of pain and hard work, wept silently, thanking a God she believed hadn't abandoned them. Lena didn't cry. She felt an immense relief, a slackening of the rope that was always tight around her neck, but her relief was tinged with suspicion. Miracles didn't happen in her world, at least not without a price. But for now, they were safe. The threat of eviction was gone, and for a few months, they would have a roof over their heads. Richard, upon receiving Matthew's report, felt a pang of satisfaction. He had solved the problem. He could now return to his life, but he couldn't. The image of Lena wouldn't leave him, and the worry for her well-being became a constant presence in his thoughts. It was Luke who, innocently, reopened the connection. "Daddy, can we go to the park today? The one near where I got lost?" His son's request caught him by surprise. The park was just a few blocks from the alley. Part of Richard wanted to say no, to maintain the safe distance his money provided, but another part, a stubborn curiosity and an inexplicable need to make sure Lena was truly okay, compelled him to agree. While Luke ran for the swings, Richard walked to the edge of the park, his gaze scanning the adjacent streets. And then he saw her. Lena was sitting on the curb near a fruit stand, a small wooden box on her lap. She was selling homemade brownies, small squares wrapped in cellophane. Her posture was the same as ever, upright, alert, a small sentinel at her post. Seeing her, Luke ran in her direction, a wide smile on his face. "It's the water girl," he shouted, with the pure spontaneity of childhood. Lena looked up, and for an instant, Richard saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a shadow of caution. Luke stopped in front of her without any ceremony. "Hi, my name is Luke. What's yours?" "Lena," she replied, her voice a little louder than last time. "Do you want a brownie?" Luke asked, pointing to her box. Before Richard could intervene, Luke took his own allowance money from his pocket, a few coins he treasured, and held them out to Lena. "I want to buy one. For you." His son's gesture, an unconscious imitation of Lena's own generosity, hit Richard hard. Lena looked at the coins in Luke's hand, then at the boy's eager face. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips for the first time. She took one of the brownies and placed it in Luke's hand, but gently pushed the coins back. "It's a gift," she said. In that moment, the invisible barrier between their two worlds seemed to dissolve. They were just two children, sharing a brownie on a sunny afternoon. Richard watched the scene, his heart tight. It was an image of pure innocence, but he knew the world around them was anything but innocent. As Luke unwrapped the brownie and shared it with Lena, sitting down next to her on the curb as if they were old friends, Richard noticed the stares, mothers strolling with their children in the park, dressed in designer workout clothes, cast disapproving glances. They whispered among themselves, discreetly pointing at the millionaire banker's son sitting next to the street kid. Prejudice was a toxic fog, invisible but palpable. He felt the social pressure begin to build, a subtle but powerful force demanding that he separate the two children, that he re-establish the natural order of things. But seeing Luke's genuine smile and the rare sparkle in Lena's eyes, he found himself paralyzed, torn between what his world expected of him and what his heart, for the first time in a long time, told him was right. The idyllic scene of the two children sharing a brownie was abruptly shattered by the arrival of a gleaming black town car. The driver opened the rear door, and out stepped Beatrice, Richard's wife. Her stiletto heels clicked on the asphalt with the precision of marching sentinels. She wore an immaculate dress, sunglasses that hid any trace of emotion, and an expression of restrained disdain. Her arrival changed the atmosphere instantly. The fog of prejudice that had been subtle now condensed into an impending storm. She didn't say a word to Richard. Her eyes, cold and analytical, locked onto Luke, sitting on the dirty ground next to Lena. "Luke, come here." Now, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an unquestionable command, sharp as a blade. Luke, startled by his mother's tone, scrambled to his feet, the rest of the brownie forgotten in his hand. He looked from Beatrice to Lena, confused and a little frightened. Beatrice strode until she stood between her son and the girl. She looked Lena up and down, contempt evident in every line of her face. It wasn't a look of anger, but something far worse, a look of total invalidation, as if Lena were an insignificant insect, a piece of dirt to be removed. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed at the girl, her voice low enough for only them to hear. "Getting close to my son. Do you think you're going to get something from us?" Lena flinched under the weight of that gaze, but she didn't look away. She stood up, her box of brownies clutched to her chest, and met Beatrice's stare with the same silent dignity that had disarmed Richard. She didn't answer. Her silence seemed to enrage Beatrice even more. "Stay away from him. You and your kind. Don't you ever come near my family again. Do you understand?" Richard stepped forward, his throat dry. "Beatrice, stop it. She didn't do anything." "Nothing." She spun on him, her fury now visible. "You call this nothing? Our son, sitting on the ground with that. What will people think? What will they say? Have you lost your mind?" She grabbed Luke's arm forcefully. "We're leaving." As she dragged a crying Luke toward the car, something terrible happened. In the small crowd of onlookers that had formed, someone with a smartphone was recording the scene. The small red light blinked discreetly. Beatrice, blinded by rage, didn't notice. Richard saw it, but it was too late. The public humiliation, the cold cruelty in her voice, the stark contrast between the wealthy woman and the poor child. It was the kind of drama social media devoured. Beatrice pushed Luke into the car and turned to Lena one last time. In a gesture of pure contempt, she took a bill from her purse and threw it on the ground at the girl's feet. "Here, so you can forget you ever saw us." The bill fluttered down and landed on the dirty sidewalk. Lena looked at the money, then at Beatrice, and then, with a devastating calm, she bent down, picked up the bill, walked to the nearest trash can and dropped it inside. She didn't say a word. The act was more eloquent than any shout. Beatrice stood aghast for a second, the color draining from her face, before getting into the car and slamming the door. The car sped off, tires screeching. Richard was left behind, standing between the dispersing crowd and the lonely girl who had just been publicly humiliated. He looked at Lena, who was now gathering her small box of brownies, her face an impenetrable mask. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to fix what his wife had broken, but the words wouldn't come. He felt complicit, stained by her cruelty. And as he watched Lena walk away, disappearing into the crowd, he had the terrible premonition that the video of that disastrous encounter would spread like wildfire, and the consequences would be far worse than he could ever imagine. The storm was just beginning. Richard's premonition came true with terrifying speed. By the next morning, the video was the top trending topic online, filmed from an angle that perfectly captured Beatrice's arrogance and Lena's quiet dignity. The 90-second clip went explosively viral. The caption was simple and devastating. Billionaire's wife humiliates street kid for sharing a brownie with her son. Social media erupted. Thousands, then millions, of people watched, commented, and shared. The image of Beatrice throwing the money on the ground and Lena dropping it in the trash became instant symbols of class struggle, of elite arrogance versus the resilience of the poor. Beatrice's name, Richard's name, and the name of his bank were dragged through the digital mud. The outrage was a tidal wave, and the family, who had always lived in an ivory tower protected by their wealth, was now at the epicenter of a hurricane of public scrutiny. Richard's phone wouldn't stop ringing. It was partners, board members, public relations advisors, all in a panic. The bank's reputation, built over decades, was being tarnished in a matter of hours. Beatrice, at first, tried to dismiss it. "It's just the envy of the poor," she said with forced nonchalance. "They'll forget and find another target soon enough." But the storm didn't pass. On the contrary, it intensified. Reporters camped outside their mansion. Groups of protesters gathered in front of the bank's headquarters with signs calling Beatrice heartless. The pressure became unbearable. It was then that, in a desperate attempt to control the narrative, Beatrice made her gravest mistake. Advised by unscrupulous lawyers, she decided to counterattack. She gave a press conference where, with rehearsed tears, she claimed that the girl, Lena, was part of a scheme. She said Lena was aggressive, that she had tried to rob her son, that she was part of a youth gang that used children to extort money from wealthy people. She painted herself as a mother protecting her child from imminent danger. To lend credibility to her story, she filed a police report against the unidentified minor, accusing her of attempted theft and harassment. The lie was so absurd, so disconnected from the reality Richard had witnessed, that it made his stomach turn. He tried to stop her, but Beatrice was blinded by panic and the need to save her own image. The consequence was immediate and brutal. Based on a report from an influential citizen, the police acted swiftly. 2 officers, accompanied by a world-weary social worker, went to the tenement. They found Lena in the small room, caring for her bedridden grandmother. Before the terrified eyes of Inez, who could barely speak, they informed Lena that she had to come with them. Lena, 10 years old, was taken to a juvenile detention center, a euphemism for an overcrowded and notorious youth facility. She stood accused of a crime she didn't commit, her word against one of the most powerful women in the city. The news of her detainment leaked to the press, but this time the narrative was split. Some saw her as the ultimate victim. Others, influenced by Beatrice's performance, saw her as a juvenile delinquent. The truth was lost in the noise. At home, the silence was deafening. Luke, who had seen his mother's interview on television, was inconsolable. "It's not true, Daddy. Mommy lied. Lena is my friend. She gave me water." His son's cries echoed through the house, each word a knife in Richard's heart. He looked at Beatrice, who was now pale, the mask of control finally cracking. She had crossed a terrible line, and in the process had not only destroyed an innocent child's life, but had also broken something fundamental within her own family. Richard realized, with terrible clarity, that the situation had spun completely out of his control. He had tried to help Lena from the shadows, with money and discretion. Now he saw that wasn't enough. The injustice was public, brutal, and it was happening because of his family. He had to act, no longer as a distant observer, but as an active participant. The game had changed drastically. It was no longer about protecting his reputation or his comfort. It was about saving a child, and perhaps, in the process, saving what was left of his own soul. The image of Lena being led away by police haunted Richard. It was no longer a matter of distant conscience. It was an open wound, pulsing at the center of his life. Luke's insistence was salt in that wound. The boy refused to accept his mother's narrative, defending Lena with the fierce, unshakable loyalty that only children possess. "You have to do something, Daddy. Get Lena out of there. Tell everyone that Mommy lied." His son's plea was an echo of his own conscience. He could no longer hide behind proxies and anonymous donations. The battle was now public, and he had to choose a side. His choice put him on a direct collision course with Beatrice. The tension between them became a cold war waged in the silent halls of their mansion. Conversations were monosyllabic, gazes heavy with unspoken accusations. "You are going to ruin this family," Beatrice hissed at him one night, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "Over some little gutter snipe. You are choosing her over me, your wife." "This isn't about choosing, Beatrice. It's about doing what's right," he replied, his voice tired but firm. "You put an innocent child in a detention center, a child who helped our son. How do you expect me to live with that?" The external and internal pressure was reaching a breaking point. The scandal was beginning to tangibly affect his business. Key investors were expressing their concern over the bank's image. The board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting. Richard knew his once unshakable position was at risk, but for the first time, the fear of losing his empire was less than the fear of losing his humanity. He hired the best lawyer in the city, a man named Arthur Adler, known for his integrity and for taking on lost causes. He gave him a single instruction: "Get that girl out of there, whatever it takes." Adler began to work, but he ran into a bureaucratic and corrupt system. The influence of Beatrice and her lawyers ran deep. Witnesses were intimidated. Reports were misplaced. The fight would be harder than Richard had imagined. While the legal battle dragged on, Richard did something he never thought he would do. He went to visit Inez. He found the old woman in her damp room, more frail and shrunken than ever. Lena's absence had stolen the last spark of life from her. He sat by her bed, feeling like a clumsy giant in the tiny space. He didn't know what to say. An apology felt like an insult. He simply took the old woman's trembling, bony hand. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words sounding inadequate. "I'm going to bring her back. I promise." Inez looked at him with clouded eyes, where a single tear formed and traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "She's a good girl," she murmured, her voice a faint thread. "She has a good heart. Don't let her be lost in that place." That plea from that dying woman sealed Richard's commitment. The promise was no longer just to himself or his son. It was to this grandmother who was losing the only thing she had left in the world. He left the tenement feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Helping Lena was no longer just about correcting an injustice. It was about preserving goodness in a world that seemed determined to crush it. His relationship with Beatrice deteriorated daily. She accused him of betrayal, of sabotaging her efforts to defend herself. "You're destroying everything we built," she screamed during a particularly ugly fight. "No," he replied, with a calm that frightened her. "You already did that when you decided to lie." The chasm between them was now unbridgeable, and Richard knew that to fulfill his promise to Inez, he would have to sacrifice the marriage he had once believed was the foundation of his life. The decision was made. He would see this through, no matter what he lost along the way. Luke's insistence and the promise made to Inez became Richard's true north. The turning point came when Arthur Adler, after days of frustrating investigation, found a break. The person who had filmed the original video. She was a young university student who, terrified by the fallout, had remained anonymous. Adler convinced her to testify, guaranteeing her protection. More importantly, she had a longer, unedited version of the video, which showed what happened before and after the viral clip. The full video was irrefutable proof of Lena's innocence. It showed Luke approaching her first, the friendly sharing of the brownie, Beatrice's aggressive arrival, and crucially, it showed Lena trying to walk away peacefully before being verbally assaulted. There was no harassment, no attempted theft. There was only a frightened child trying to defend herself from the fury of a powerful adult. With this new evidence in hand, the pressure on the justice system and on Beatrice became overwhelming. The castle of lies she had built began to crumble. Public opinion, which had been divided, turned crushingly against her. The hashtag Justice for Lena dominated social media, pressured by the scandal that now threatened not only his wife's reputation, but also her freedom. For filing a false police report, Richard confronted her. "You're going to drop the charges, Beatrice." Now, he found her in her walk-in closet, a sanctuary of luxury and order that now felt like a cage. She looked at him, her face pale and her eyes red. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a fragile desperation. "If I do that, I'll be admitting guilt. I'll be humiliated." "You're going to be humiliated either way," Richard said, not cruelly, but stating a fact. "But if you drop the charges, maybe you can start to repair the damage you've done, at least for Luke. He needs to see his mother do the right thing, for once." The mention of their son hit its mark. Beatrice finally broke. The charges were dropped. Lena was released from the juvenile detention center after 2 long, terrifying weeks. Richard was there to pick her up. She walked out of the grey building, smaller and thinner than he remembered. Her face was blank, her eyes dull, as if the light inside her had been dimmed. Beatrice, in another clumsy attempt to fix things, tried the only solution she knew: money. She sent an emissary with a check for an exorbitant amount to Lena and her grandmother, a compensation for the inconvenience. The emissary returned with the check torn to pieces. Lena's message, relayed by the man, was simple. "Tell her I don't want her money. I want her to leave my grandmother and me in peace, and I want the world to know the truth." The refusal, once again, disarmed the logic of power and wealth. Lena didn't want a handout. She wanted dignity. She wanted her grandmother's safety, the assurance that they would no longer be hunted. Richard understood this deeply. His help from now on would have to be different, no longer the invisible power of money, but visible, committed action. He began to use his influence differently. Instead of solving problems with checks, he started opening doors. He put pressure on city officials, exposed the squalid conditions of Taggart's tenement, and used his contacts to find a small, clean apartment for Lena and Inez in a better neighborhood. He arranged for the best medical care available for the grandmother, and, most importantly, he was present. He visited them, brought groceries, talked with Inez, and to his surprise, he began to feel more at home in that small apartment than he did in his own mansion. But his actions did not go unnoticed. Taggart, the landlord who profited from misery, began to feel threatened. Other powerful figures, who benefited from the system Richard was now challenging, began to see him as a traitor to his class. He started receiving veiled warnings, subtle threats. The world he once dominated was now turning against him, and Richard realized that the true fight for justice came at a much higher cost than he had ever imagined. He had freed Lena from one prison, only to find himself walking into another. The years that followed were a quiet current, pulling everyone's life to new shores. The distance between Richard and Beatrice became an ocean. They lived in the same house but on different emotional continents, bound only by a fractured love for their son. Richard dedicated himself to ensuring Lena and her grandmother had the stability they had been denied. Inez's health improved with proper treatment, and though her illness was incurable, she found a comfort and peace she hadn't known in years. Lena, finally free from the burden of daily survival, was allowed to be a child. She flourished in school, revealing a sharp intellect and a thirst for knowledge that impressed everyone. Richard discreetly funded her education through a scholarship established by one of his foundations. He and Lena developed a peculiar bond, an unlikely friendship forged in the fire of crisis. He was a quiet father figure, a distant protector, and she, with her precocious wisdom and unshakable integrity, became a kind of moral compass for him. The friendship between Luke and Lena, however, was the most powerful transformative force. Against all expectations and social pressures, they remained inseparable. Richard would pick them up from school, take them for ice cream, to the movies. They were just two kids, laughing and playing, oblivious to the barriers the world insisted on placing between them. Time passed, swift and relentless. Adolescence arrived, bringing with it new complexities. Luke grew into a quiet, observant young man, with his father's kindness and a deep aversion to his mother's superficial world. Lena blossomed into a young woman of serene beauty and steely determination, the top of her class, with dreams of becoming a lawyer to defend people like her grandmother. Richard watched them grow with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He saw in them the promise of a better world, but he also felt the weight of the past that bound them together. The storm seemed to have passed, life finding a new, precarious balance. But the old wounds, though scarred over, still ached beneath the surface. The reunion that would change everything happened in an unlikely place, the cold, impersonal halls of Richard's bank. Lena, now a brilliant intern at a top law school, had been assigned to a summer project in the legal department of a firm that consulted for the bank. Luke, having just graduated with a business degree, was starting his career there, more out of family obligation than passion. They passed each other near the elevators. For a moment, they were just two strangers in a sea of grey suits. Then their eyes met. The recognition was instant, an electric current that spanned the years. "Lena," Luke said, the name coming out like a breath. "Luke." Her smile was shy, but it lit up the entire hallway. The conversation that followed was awkward at first, but soon the easy familiarity of their childhood friendship returned. They laughed, reminiscing about ice cream and afternoons in the park. There was a new depth to their interaction, an awareness of the journey they had traveled, of the battles that had been fought in their names. There they stood, two young adults, products of opposite worlds, meeting as equals in the heart of the empire that had nearly destroyed them. The scene did not go unnoticed. Beatrice, walking down the hall, saw the reunion. She stopped, her body rigid, her face a mask of shock and fury. The sight of Lena, no longer a street kid but a confident, well-dressed young woman, talking with her son in this environment, was like seeing a ghost. The ghost of her greatest failure, her deepest humiliation. The calm she had rebuilt over the years shattered. Old wounds tore open, and a poison that had long been dormant surged to the surface. She approached, her presence chilling the air. "You!" she hissed at Lena, her voice thick with ancient hatred. "I can't believe you dare to show your face here, after everything your family did to mine." Luke and Lena looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Luke asked. Beatrice let out a bitter laugh. "He hasn't told you, has he? about how your grandmother, the sainted invalid, was responsible for my mother's death." Beatrice's accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Lena felt the floor vanish from beneath her feet. Beatrice's mother's death, her grandmother, the words didn't make sense, fragments of a reality she didn't know. She looked at Luke for support and saw the same shock and confusion mirrored in his eyes. "Mom, that's insane," Luke said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt. "Lena's grandmother is one of the kindest people I know. What are you talking about?" Richard, who had been alerted by his secretary to the scene unfolding in the hallway, arrived in time to hear the accusation. His face went pale. "Beatrice, that's enough. Not here, not now." But Beatrice was beyond reason. The resentment, nursed and fermented for years, had finally exploded. "No! They need to know. Everyone needs to know the truth behind this charity charade you've built." She turned to Lena, her eyes glittering with an old, twisted pain. "My mother, Richard's mother-in-law. She was the original owner of that property where your grandmother lived, the tenement. My mother was a good woman, too naive. She trusted people. And your grandmother, Inez, she took advantage of that. They were friends." The word dripped with contempt. "Inez was her housekeeper, and my mother helped her, gave her food, money. But your grandmother was ambitious. She wanted more. She convinced my mother to put the property in her name as a safeguard against my father, who was a difficult man. She promised she would give it back as soon as things settled down." Lena listened to the story, a rising nausea in her gut. Beatrice's narrative was so convincing, charged with such raw emotion that for a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Could her grandmother, the woman who had raised her with such love and sacrifice, be capable of such a betrayal? "My mother got sick," Beatrice continued, her voice breaking. "A fast, devastating cancer. On her deathbed, she asked Inez to sign the property back so that I, her only child, wouldn't be left with nothing. And your grandmother refused, said the house was hers by right. My mother died of a broken heart. Feeling betrayed by the only person she trusted, I was left alone with nothing until I met Richard. The story, told with the force of a Greek tragedy, left everyone in silence. It was the secret, the festering wound in Beatrice's heart that explained everything. Her prejudice, her hatred, her disproportionate reaction years ago. This wasn't just about a street kid. It was about a vendetta that spanned generations. Richard, who knew fragments of the story, but never the full, poisoned version, tried to intervene. "Beatrice, that's not the whole truth. It's my truth," she screamed. "It's the truth that robbed me of my mother and my inheritance." Lena, recovering from the initial shock, felt a surge of strength. She knew her grandmother. She knew the goodness in her heart, the honesty in her bones. "That's a lie," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the tension. "My grandmother would never do that." "Of course you'd say that," Beatrice scoffed, "defending a thief like mother, like daughter, or granddaughter, in this case." The insult was the final straw for Luke. He stepped between his mother and Lena, a human shield. "That's enough, Mom, you've gone too far." The confrontation dissolved as bank security, having been alerted, arrived discreetly. Richard, his face grim, led Beatrice away, leaving Luke and Lena alone in the hallway that now felt like a battlefield. The happy reunion had turned into a nightmare. An old shadow had returned, darker and more menacing than ever, threatening to destroy not only their future, but also the sanctity of Lena's past. She had to know the truth, not Beatrice's version, but the real truth, buried under layers of pain and time. And she knew there was only one person who could tell her, her grandmother. The ride back to the small apartment she shared with her grandmother was the longest of Lena's life. Every word of Beatrice's accusation echoed in her mind, warring with decades of love and trust. She found Inez sitting by the window, knitting in the soft afternoon light. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that the ugliness of the accusation felt even more grotesque. Lena sat at her grandmother's feet, just as she had as a child, and with a heavy heart. She told her what had happened. As Lena spoke, Inez's face transformed. Serenity gave way to a deep sorrow, an ancient pain that seemed to well up from her soul. When Lena finished, tears were streaming freely down the old woman's wrinkled face. "It is true, my child," she whispered, her voice as fragile as a dry leaf, but not the way she told it. And then, the real story came pouring out. Beatrice's mother, Clara, and Inez had indeed been the best of friends. Clara was a gentle soul, trapped in an abusive marriage to a cruel, profligate man. It was Clara who, fearing her husband would lose the house to gambling debts, had begged Inez to take the property in her name. It was an act of desperation to protect the future of her daughter, Beatrice. When Clara fell ill, Inez continued, her voice choked with emotion, she made me promise 2 things. First, that I would never let her husband get his hands on the house, and second, that I would look after Beatrice as if she were my own daughter. She knew the man was dangerous. After Clara's death, her husband tried to take the house from Inez. There was a legal battle, but since the house was legally in Inez's name, he lost. Furious, he poisoned young Beatrice's mind, feeding her the twisted version of the story, painting Inez as a greedy traitor. He isolated her from Inez, nurturing her grudge for years until he himself disappeared, leaving Beatrice alone with her pain and his lies. "I never stopped trying to reach her," Inez said, sobbing, but she wouldn't listen. The hatred her father planted was too strong. "I kept everything, all of Clara's letters, the legal documents, her original will where she explained everything. I saved it for the day Beatrice was ready to hear the truth." Meanwhile, at the mansion, the truth was exploding from another source. Luke, shaken and furious, broke with his mother definitively. "I can't live with this hatred anymore, Mom. I love Lena, I always have, and I'm going to be with her, no matter what you say or think." He packed a bag, leaving behind a stunned Beatrice and a heartbroken but resigned Richard. His son's departure was the final blow for Richard. He knew he had to end this cycle of pain once and for all. He went up to the attic, a place he hadn't visited in years, and opened an old trunk that had belonged to his father. Inside, he found what he was looking for, the journals of his father-in-law, Beatrice's father. He spent the night reading the yellowed pages, revealing the dark truth of a cruel and manipulative man. And then he found the letter, a letter his father-in-law had written to his own father, Luke's grandfather, years ago, confessing to manipulating his daughter to ensure she would marry a wealthy man like Richard. The letter was proof of everything. The moment of truth arrived the next day. Richard called a meeting. In his living room were Beatrice, pale and defiant, and Luke and Lena, united and apprehensive. Inez, frail but determined, sat beside her granddaughter, holding a box of old documents. "Beatrice," Richard began, his voice grave, "there are things you need to know." He started to read from the journal, from the letter. At the same time, Inez, with Lena's help, presented Clara's letters, her delicate handwriting telling a story of friendship and fear. The truth, coming from 2 irrefutable sources, hit Beatrice with the force of a tidal wave. The narrative that had sustained her life, her hatred, her grudge, it all crumbled to dust. She looked at the box of documents, at the photo of her mother smiling alongside Inez, and a dry sob escaped her lips. The truth didn't set her free. It broke her. The revelation settled over the room, like the silence after an explosion. Beatrice stared at her mother's letters, the familiar handwriting a testament to a love and friendship she had twisted into betrayal. Her face, once a mask of anger and certainty, collapsed. It was the face of someone who discovers their entire life was built on a foundation of sand. She didn't weep. The pain was too deep for tears. She simply rose, without looking at anyone, and walked out of the room, up the stairs to her bedroom. The door clicked shut, a soft sound that seemed to echo like the end of an era. No one followed her. Some wounds could only be tended by time and solitude, if they could be healed at all. In the heavy silence that remained, Luke went to Lena and Inez. He took the old woman's hand and kissed it respectfully. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For all the years of pain my family has caused you." Inez smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "The past is the past, my son. What matters is the future you will build together." Just then, a lawyer, the same Arthur Adler who had defended Lena years ago, entered the room. He had been summoned by Richard. He carried a briefcase and a solemn expression. "Richard, Luke, there is one more thing." He turned to Luke. "Your grandfather, Richard's father, left something for you in his will. It was a special clause, a considerable trust fund, but there was a condition." Everyone in the room held their breath. The condition was that you would only gain access to these resources when you became an independent man, capable of your own decisions. And specifically, he hesitated, glancing toward the closed bedroom door. If you completely severed the bonds of emotional and financial dependency on your mother. Your grandfather feared the influence her bitterness might have on you. He wanted you to be free to build your own life, with your own values. The shock was palpable. Luke looked at his father, who nodded slowly. Richard had known about the clause, but had never used it as a weapon. He had waited for his son to make his own decision for his own reasons. Luke's break with his mother hadn't been for money, but for principle. He had, unknowingly, fulfilled his grandfather's condition. The irony was overwhelming. Money, which had been the source of so much conflict and pain, now reappeared as a tool for liberation and a new beginning. Luke and Lena looked at each other. There was no triumph in their eyes, only a deep, quiet understanding. They had faced prejudice, injustice, and lies. They had fought not for wealth, but for dignity, truth, and love. And now, they were being given the means to turn their struggle into a legacy. The resolution of the conflicts was not an explosion of happiness, but a quiet, profound relief. Richard, free from the weight of family secrets, felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He looked at his son and the young woman he loved and saw in them not just a couple, but the start of a new cycle, one based on truth and empathy. Inez, with her best friend's honor finally restored, felt the weight of decades lift from her shoulders. She could rest peacefully, knowing her granddaughter was safe and loved. Luke and Lena, hand in hand, knew their journey together was just beginning. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other and a solid foundation of truth on which to build their future. Justice had been served, not in a courtroom, but in hearts and in the revelation of truth. The narrative arcs were closing, not with perfect endings, but with the realistic, hopeful promise of new beginnings. The building in the heart of downtown, which for decades had stood as a symbol of the cold, calculated power of Richard's bank, began to undergo a transformation. The mirrored glass walls that once reflected a distant, impersonal sky were gradually replaced with a warmer, more welcoming facade. Where there had once been silent, tense boardrooms, the laughter of children now echoed. Luke and Lena, using the resources from the grandfather's inheritance, chose not to build an empire for themselves, but a refuge for others. They created the New Dawn Foundation, a home and educational center for street-involved children, the same kind of child Lena had once been. The place wasn't a shelter, it was a home. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the comforting aroma of brownies baking in the large, communal kitchen. In the hallways, The sound of expensive shoes hurrying along was replaced by the patter of bare feet running across heated floors. Lena, with her law degree, ensured that every child's rights were protected, fighting against the system's bureaucracy. Luke, with his business acumen, ensured the foundation was sustainable, a safe harbor for generations to come. They worked side by side, their love manifesting not just in private gestures, but in the work they built together. Richard, now retired, was a constant presence at the foundation. He was no longer the millionaire banker, but simply Grandpa Rick. He spent his afternoons reading stories to the little ones, helping with homework, fixing broken toys. Amidst that chaotic, genuine joy, he found the humanity that money and power had suffocated. He rediscovered the wealth of sincere hugs, spontaneous smiles, and simple human connection. He and Inez, who had moved into a comfortable apartment near the foundation, would often sit together in the garden, watching the children play. They were two survivors from different worlds, united by a shared love for their grandchildren and the peace they had finally found. The transformation of the characters was visible and profound. Lena, the resilient girl who offered her only bottle of water, had kept her generous spirit, now amplified by the ability to help hundreds. Luke, the protected yet wealthy boy, had become a man who took risks, not for profit, but for justice and compassion. And Richard, the pragmatic banker, discovered that the greatest investment of his life wasn't in the stock market, but in the future of a child. Beatrice remained in her mansion, a lonely figure amidst the empty luxury. She never visited the foundation. She refused all attempts at reconciliation, trapped in her bitterness and the shame of a life built on a lie. She was unable to accept the transformative power of empathy and forgiveness. Her absence was a sad but realistic note in the symphony of new beginnings, a reminder that not all wounds can be healed. The story ended not with a final period, but with a new cycle beginning. On a sunny afternoon in the foundation's courtyard, one of the younger children, who had arrived scared and mistrustful, saw a new boy crying in a corner, thirsty. Without hesitation, the child took their own cup of juice, walked over to the boy, and offered it, saying softly, "It's okay. You don't have to be scared. I'll stay here with you." Lena and Luke, watching from a distance, exchanged a look filled with emotion. That simple act of compassion, echoing an encounter in a dirty alley years ago, was proof that kindness, once planted, continues to bloom. The greatest riches in life, they now knew, were not kept in vaults, but shared in gestures of solidarity and courage. And no adversity, however great, should ever be accepted without a fight. For in the heart of every struggle for justice lies the seed of a new and hopeful tomorrow.